Sup, everybody. Once again, this will be nothing but a bunch of pretentious theoretical bullshit. I'm going to see if I can kill two birds with one stone here. I want to present a critique of the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, which I've never done before in a YouTube video. And then I want to take that critique and use it to make a new positive argument against the existence of God. It's risky. It's risky, I know, but risky is my middle name. That's not true. That's not true. Risky is not my middle name. My middle name is underwhelming, and I can't do anything cool with that in conversation. So thanks a lot, Mom. Thanks, Dad. Appreciate it. Moving on. So for the four of you on YouTube who have not heard the Kalam cosmological argument, it goes like this. Premise 1, anything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause. Psst, and by the way, that cause is God. Now, it should go without saying that the easiest and most obvious way to refute this argument is to point out that even if you completely grant the conclusion of the argument as true, that doesn't lead you to God. Nothing about the universe having a cause means that there exists a personal, emotional, disembodied mind with moral concerns, infinite knowledge, and the superpower of causing events to occur just by thinking them. And of course, every theological attempt to bridge that gap, at least every attempt I'm aware of, has failed miserably. But I'm not going down that road. Save that for another day maybe. But for now, I'm going to try to tackle this from a different angle. I suspect that one of the things that makes the Kalam argument so appealing to apologists is the fact that it's sort of seen as an argument for the modern age. I mean, it bridges the gap between theology and science by calling upon what we know from Big Bang cosmology in order to support its key premise, that the universe began to exist. But what does science have to say regarding Kalam's other premise? I mean, it seems highly intuitive that anything which begins to exist has a cause, but thermodynamics tells us something a little different. What it tells us is that nothing actually begins to exist. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy, which is what everything is made out of, even matter, even atoms, can be neither created nor destroyed. It only changes form. So how can we possibly know that anything which begins to exist has a cause when we have no verifiable account of anything ever beginning to exist? Well, things begin to exist all the time, right? This is observable to anyone. People begin to exist. Plants begin to exist. Chemicals begin to exist. Scott, even you began to exist, you may say. Well, not really. You can break me down into smaller and smaller pieces, remember. And by no account that we have has any of the stuff of which I'm composed ever come into existence, at least not in the same way that creationists believe the stars and planets literally came into existence. Everything that makes up me existed before I ever did. Scott isn't its own thing. Scott is just the configuration in which these 7 billion atoms are assembled. Everything you see in the universe today is the same exact stuff you would have seen in the universe 5 billion years ago or 10 billion years ago. Nothing's been added. Nothing's been taken away. The only thing different is the shape, the form that the stuff has taken. Now, in everyday language, when we say that something has come into existence, like a stapler or a person, we're really just referring to the fact that the tiny little pieces of stuff making up that thing have assembled into a shape they've never ever taken before, which we then perceive as that thing. So saying that a person or a chemical is an example of something that's actually come into existence is no less absurd than saying, look, I've brought a fist into existence, and now I've removed the fist from existence. A fist isn't an entity. It's a specific kind of relationship between my fingers and my palm. Likewise, a person or a building or a chemical is nothing more than a specific kind of relationship between very small stuff. And the only reason that this seems counterintuitive to us is because we can't see things that small. When our human brains look at these trillions and trillions and trillions of tiny things interacting with one another, we think we're looking at one big thing, but we're not. What our brains perceive as that big thing isn't a thing at all. It's an occurrence. It's just something that trillions and trillions and trillions of tiny things are doing with each other. Imagine you have a bird's eye view of a team of cheerleaders practicing their formations on a football field. In one moment, they position themselves so as to form what looks like a triangle. In another moment, they form a straight line. No one would be deluded into thinking that each of these formations they take is its own entity, a thing with its own existence. A formation is just a relationship between certain things, namely cheerleaders in this case. Now, imagine that the football field is several trillion times its current size. The cheerleading team practicing on it has several trillion members, and the formations they take are several trillion times larger. Has anything qualitatively changed about the ontology of those formations? Is there a certain number of cheerleaders that would need to be in a formation for that formation to stop being a relationship between certain entities and start being an entity itself? No, of course not. That would be absurd. Anywhere you try to draw the line would be arbitrary. But this is all that's going on in the instance of a person or a building or a chemical beginning to exist. What we perceive as people, buildings, and chemicals are really just what tiny things are doing with each other. And those tiny things, we know from thermodynamics, do not begin or cease to exist. Aha, you might say. And you would say it just like that. You'd go, aha! But scientists have proven that the universe began to exist, hence the second premise. Well, we know that the Big Bang was responsible for the universe as we know it. So, in that sense, the Big Bang is what created the universe we see. But as for what happened before the Big Bang, we aren't capable of knowing that, or if that's even a coherent concept. The jury is not in on whether it's accurate to say that the universe began to exist, and anyone who says otherwise is either misinformed or lying to you. Of course, that doesn't stop an apologist from cherry-picking quotes from experts that lend any support to the idea that the universe's existence had a definite beginning, all the while ignoring experts in the field with anything different to say. But the point is, even if it could be demonstrated right now that the universe is the one thing, the only thing that did literally begin to exist, and I say that in the sense that the stuff of which the universe is composed didn't exist at one point and then existed in the next, it still wouldn't do anything to support the Kalam argument. Because if we weren't around to observe the universe begin to exist, and nothing else beside the universe has ever begun to exist, then we have zero empirical basis for knowing that if something begins to exist, it has a cause. And therefore, we're not justified in making the claim that the universe couldn't have come into existence without being caused by something else that exists. That's just a groundless assertion. However intuitive it may seem to human brains on a surface level. And it's not merely a lack of empirical data, even philosophically, even logically. If a thing ever did begin to exist, it's impossible to demonstrate that it could have been caused to do so by something that already exists. Riddle me this: how does something that exists cause something that doesn't exist to do anything, let alone start existing? The answer is it can't. Because laws of causality only work between things that already exist. There is no such thing as a causal relationship between the existent and the non-existent. For something to be affected by a cause, it must have existed prior to being affected. If it didn't exist prior to being affected, then there was nothing to affect, and thus no effect took place. It's not just physically impossible, it's logically incoherent for something that exists to cause something which doesn't exist to start existing, since that would entail that a thing existed prior to its own existence, that a thing's existence and non-existence were both the case simultaneously, which is, of course, a logical contradiction. Here, let's put it into these terms. Let's say that God causes X to begin existing. Now, despite the fact that we have no awareness of any mechanism that would or could accomplish such a task, we have to ask ourselves this: if God is what's doing the causing in this equation, what is on the receiving end of that cause? Namely, what is it that's being affected by this cause? Well, it's either X that's being affected, or it's nothing that's being affected. If it were Y or Z or anything else being affected, then you're not talking about X beginning to exist anymore. You're talking about Y or Z changing form and calling that new form X. But that's not what Kalam proponents are suggesting happened. So if the affector is God, then the affectee is either X or it's nothing. So let's look at both of those. If X is what's being affected by this cause, then we're saying that X already existed prior to being affected in order to be affectable. Otherwise, X would not have been affected since no such X existed. But of course, if X indeed existed prior to being affected, then God did not in fact cause anything to begin to exist. What if it's nothing? If nothing is what's being affected by this cause, then the problem is pretty self-explanatory. Literally, nothing has been affected by God. In other words, God has not affected anything, and thus, once again, nothing has actually been caused to exist. So it should be abundantly clear by now that the statement, God caused X to begin existing, no matter what X is logically incoherent from any angle, and thus impossible. It's just a string of words. It sounds good, but it doesn't have any more applicable meaning to reality than the statement, Jim is a married bachelor. And since this is precisely something God is defined as having done, can you guess where I'm going with this? God is a logically incoherent concept and does not exist. So this is what I'm calling the Kalam cosmological argument for the non-existence of God. And if I were to simplify it as best I could and present a sort of syllogistic skeleton of the argument, it would go something like this. Premise 1. Nothing which exists can cause something which does not exist to begin existing. Premise 2. Given 1, anything which begins to exist was not caused to do so by something which exists. Premise 3. The universe began to exist. Premise 4. Given 2 and 3, the universe was not caused to exist by anything which exists. Premise 5. God caused the universe to exist. Conclusion. Given 4 and 5, God does not exist. Now, I've spent a good chunk of this video defending premise 1. As for premise 3, I could take it or leave it. Whether the universe had a definite beginning is not something that's been established by science, as I've said, but the theist is now left with a choice. They can reject premise 3, thereby forfeiting the original Kalam argument, or they can embrace premise 3, thereby conceding that God does not exist. Probably don't want to do that one. There is a third option, though, obviously. Of course there is. There always is. The theist could embrace premise 3, but reject premise 1. But in order to do that, they'll need to demonstrate, not just assert, demonstrate that it is possible for something which exists to cause something which doesn't exist to begin existing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will make for some quality entertainment. Peace!